Okay. I'd like to welcome everyone to this presentation by Anita Nowak on Empathy is Our Superpower. My name is Catherine Hess. I'm the Associate Vice President for Student Affairs and Outreach at EPFL. And as such, the Jour Santé, the Health Week at EPFL, is something that's under my responsibility. And I'm very delighted by the events that are taking place this week. So I'd like to start by introducing our speaker today. As I said, her name is Anita Nowak, and she has a PhD in education from McGill. But I went to visit her webpage to find out more about her in order to present her, and I think it was quite interesting. She expresses her statement of personal objective as being to serve values-driven organizations dedicated to social impact. And her statement of professional objective I find very interesting: to scale purposeful empathy worldwide. So she describes herself as follows: a subject matter expert on empathy and social entrepreneurship, a visionary educator committed to sustainability and social justice, an earnest champion of people's goals and dreams and the achievement of their potential, the successful co-creator of an innovative programs and initiatives, an outstanding communicator and integrative thinker who values integrity and inclusivity, emotionally intelligent leader and industrious team player, and finally, a natural-born connector of like-spirited people and forger of meaningful partnerships for impact. This all makes me very eager to hear more presentation about empathy, which I believe indeed to be a superpower. So, Anita, looking forward very much to your talk. After Anita's talk, just one last thing, there'll be a possibility to ask questions for Anita to answer. And for that, you will be able to ask your questions in the Q&A part of the webinar. So, Anita, over to you.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for that warm introduction. Obviously, a lot of that language is marketing speak. I wouldn't necessarily, with a little more humility, describe myself in those terms. But I'm delighted to be part of this conference. I think it says a lot about your organization that you value empathy to bring me in as a speaker. So feel free at any point to put a question in the chat. And Catherine, if there is a question, feel free to interrupt me so that I can respond in real time for clarity or elaboration. So today I want to talk about why I believe empathy is our superpower. I actually think it's the second most powerful trait we have, second only to love. And I'll explain why I believe that from an academic and a theoretical standpoint, but also from a lived experience standpoint. So often when I teach classes at McGill, I begin with this slide. And just to set context for why I think empathy is so important, I invite students in my class to join me on a spaceship, and I pretend that we're all aliens that are traveling to planet Earth on October 1st to do some anthropology. And if this, this spaceship of aliens came to visit us, there would be a bunch of really wonderful things they might notice about humanity's ingenuity. The fact that we've created cities with 20, 30 million people. I just think about all of the creative genius that has to go into a city, or the fact that we organize ourselves as a gathering of nations to work towards world peace, obviously with varying degrees of success. But that's our goal. We strive to improve ourselves, whether it's through physical fitness or feats of the imagination. We're, trying to send spaceship to Mars, as far as I know. And we're trying to develop artificial intelligence with an open debate on whether that's a good thing or bad thing. So, of course, I think the aliens visiting the planet would have a lot of positive things to say about humanity. However, they might also notice a few things. And here are some data points that I want to point to. So they might notice, first of all, that there are 8 people on the planet. I think the latest report from people who study the divide between rich and poor have come to the conclusion that there are 8 men, all of them are men, who have the same combined wealth as the bottom half of humanity's combined wealth. So some people live in absolutely glorious experiences and others do not. And even in the wealthiest nations on the planet, there are tens of thousands of people who are unhoused. They would also notice that about 1 billion people on the planet lack access to safe drinking water with massive health consequences, as you can imagine. And 1 billion people practice open defecation, again, with massive health implications. And then it would be impossible to ignore that, the aliens observing how we're behaving on the planet would realize that we're really polluting our own environment and the planet that gives us life. The air is being polluted. We are, killing our biodiversity through all sorts of acts of pillage. And our oceans are being contaminated by plastics. And we are digging for oil, extracting for oil, which is causing the climate to change. And all for what? For more consumption and sometimes ridiculous consumption. So the implications are that we're faced with massive fires due to climate change and droughts and storms. And these storms are really they're impacting the people who did not create them and have the least means to mitigate their impacts, right? So we have to take that into consideration. And that is something that we need to think about when we consider empathy. Who do we have empathy for? Only for the people in our peer group, or do we have empathy for people we may never meet on the planet? Now that's at a macro level, and it's not meant to depress you. But if we look at a micro level, we're also not flourishing as people on the planet, right? We're faced with a massive loneliness epidemic and mental health epidemic. So I believe the world needs more empathy, and so do we. All right. So that is the high level context of this presentation. And then I'm going to get into more of the weeds on how it improves. If we decide to turn up the volume of empathy in our lives, how it improves not only our personal health and well-being, our relationships, our workplaces, our schools, our organizations, but it also can have a massive impact on the world. All right. So close to 3 years, no, more than that, close to 3,000 days ago, so I think I'm tipping towards the 8th year, I started to post daily empathy posts. And 8 years ago, I'd have to spend 5-10 minutes on Google to do a search for a story on empathy. Now the internet proliferates with stories about empathy. And in fact, 4 years ago, sort of towards the beginning of the pandemic, the most unusual suspects, Fortune magazine and Inc. magazine, was cluing into the idea that empathic leadership and empathic cultures are actually really important. And of course, this is something that matters to Gen Z. It matters. I believe the generation that's coming up the rank understands the fundamental need for empathy for one another, and that we need to elevate our empathic consciousness. So I absolutely adore the in-class, the students that I'm teaching at McGill University, because they get it. And workplaces have to catch up to how much Gen Z is demanding more empathy. So when I ask a group of people, if I'm in a live audience, what does empathy mean to you? If you were speaking to, let's say, a 10-year-old, how would you define empathy? Typically, the answers that I get are in 3 categories. So the first is stepping into someone else's shoes, which is a great answer. Seeing through someone else's eyes, also a great answer. Or feeling what someone else is feeling. So all of those are perfectly great answers for what does empathy mean to you. But I have spent, close to 15 or maybe more than 15 years studying empathy. And I think what I'd like to do to really bring us onto the same baseline of understanding is share some of the characteristics about empathy that I have learned. And then we'll proceed and make it more practical and more relevant to your life. Okay, so the first thing to know about empathy, or that I think is valuable to know about empathy, is that it's on a continuum, along with these other words that are treated like synonyms, but they really don't mean the same thing. And I know you're paying attention to this open space, and I promise I'll fill that open space. So on the left side, you see pity, followed by sympathy, and then empathy on the other side. Now, when you pity someone, you look down on them. Oh, you poor person. So there's power asymmetry embedded in the relationship, and sympathy is not that much better. But I bring this up only to make the point that you don't want to pity someone, because there's power asymmetry. There's a sense of disdain or condemnation or judgment. And unfortunately, there's a lot of research that shows the higher up you climb an organizational structure, or the more power or resources you accrue in your life and within your own context, the less likely you are to empathize. So there's a negative correlation between power and resources and empathy. So we want to guard against that, because we don't want to enter this pity paradigm, which tends to happen with power. On the other side of the continuum, why I think empathy is so powerful is that it's the innate trait that unites us in our common humanity. I'm going to repeat that and explain and unpack that a little more. So empathy to me is the innate trait that unites us in our common humanity. So we all have things in common as humans. We share emotions like love and hope and fear and shame. And so empathy is that bridge for that common understanding where we have similar experiences. But there is an important caveat or asterisk to that definition, and that is that we don't deny or discount lived experience. So, while somebody might be telling you a story about what's going on in their life, and maybe you've, for example, a breakup, they're having a hard breakup, and you can relate because you've had a hard breakup too. Because we share the similar experience does not mean that we are sharing the same feelings perfectly. So we have to guard against projection and assumptions about what someone else is feeling, but we do have the capacity to empathize because of the shared emotions that we have. Okay, so that was the first thing, and I promise I will come back to that little empty space in case you're curious. Okay, the second thing to know about empathy is that it's actually two kinds of phenomena embedded in the same word. So I want to extract out the two types of empathy so that it's really clear how they are different. The first is affective empathy. So affect has to do with the feelings that we have. It has to do with emotions and our heart, okay? And affective empathy happens to us spontaneously. We do not choose to respond empathically when we are engaged in affective empathy. It happens to us because of our mirror neurons. So I'm going to show this to you via way of an experiment. All right, I'm going to invite you to look at the slide that I am now clicking to, and I want you to pay attention to what's happening to your face. I'm guessing that your cheeks are somewhat lifting up and you're feeling like you're in a better mood because you're in emotional resonance with this child. Now watch what happens. Unless you are a bona fide psychopath, which is a joke, but not quite, because it actually is true, you would not be able to sustain that facial expression of levity from the previous slide when you see this child who's obviously crying, okay? And what's happening in our brains is that our mirror neurons are firing. A group in Italy, in Parma, Italy, discovered the mirror neuron system with macaque monkeys. If you want me to get into the details, feel free to ask me during the Q&A. But essentially, now that we know we have mirror neurons, it explains why when somebody stubs their toe, we wince. It explains that when we walk by a park and we hear children laughing, it just puts us in a better mood. It's because we are able to be in emotional resonance with someone based on this stimulus. So again, affective empathy happens to us. We don't control it. And that is much like compassion, feeling what someone else is feeling. Okay, so that's taking up that empty space on the continuum. The second part of empathy that I find the powerful part of empathy, full of potential that I think humanity should leverage, is cognitive empathy. And that is all about perspective taking. And it involves engaging the neocortex of our brain which, the neocortex is responsible for our higher order thinking. So if you're sitting with a friend and you're having a conversation and they're telling you about something important going on in their life, and you are listening and you're trying to imagine what that experience is like for them, you are engaged in cognitive empathy. Okay. And now I want to bring this to life. So, Catherine, I'm going to ask you to pay attention to the chat box, and I'm going to ask people to put in the chat box if they want me to do this experiment with the puppy on the left, on the middle, or the right. And so you might start seeing some answers come in the chat. Maybe there's going to be one that's more popular than another. And I want you to tell me, please, Catherine, which puppy everybody on the call wants me to work with.
So please type in the chat, left, middle, or right.
That's it. Thank you, Catherine.
And so, okay, so I'm starting to get answers in the Q&A. I have 2 answers. Okay. Okay. A few more.
I think you can choose one.
Yeah. Okay. So, right. So there are so far 1 for the left, and then there's 3 for the middle, another 1 for the left, right, right, right.
Okay.
Right.
So
right,
which one do you think is the most popular?
Right is definitely the most popular.
Beautiful. Let's go with the right. Okay. Just in case you're curious, most people, when I ask this question, go for the puppy on the right. Okay. So there's something about that puppy. All right. Now, this is audience engagement, and I'm going to ask you again to populate the chat box. So please know that that ask is coming. I want you to pay attention to the puppy on the right, and I want you to look into that puppy's facial expression and body language and try to discern what that puppy is feeling. And then if the puppy could speak, what would that puppy say? So in the chat box, what I'd like you to do is just write the little simple sentence. If the puppy could talk, what would the words be? Okay, it's like a screenplay. What would the puppy say? I'll give that maybe 10 or 12 seconds. And then Catherine, when you start seeing some answers, please read them out loud.
Mm-hmm. So waiting for some answers in the Q&A. What does the puppy on the right, what would he say?
Yes, what would he say?
Okay. I'll let 3 or 4 answers come and then I'll start reading them.
Sure.
Okay. 2, 3, 4. Okay. So here, what's over there? I'm tired, feeling sad or uncertain. Who can give me a cuddle? I'm alone and would like someone to play with. I'm tired. I need affection.
Beautiful. Let's stop there. All right, guys, you did a great job. So my sense is that most people can discern that the puppy is not in some jubilant mood of exuberance and joy. Most people understand that this puppy is in a suboptimal situation. But what's interesting from the responses, because all of you are smart and engaging with the same stimulus, the same image, but some of you are reading into the image as, oh, I'm hungry, oh, I'm sad, or I'm lonely, or I want to be fed. So there's all these different interpretations, but we all know that it's not a perfect situation for the puppy. So I use this experiment to make the point that we have the capacity for cognitive empathy, but it's not a perfect science. And most of the time, when we are trying to imagine what someone else is going through, we are tainted by our own biases. So we might be hungry ourselves. We might be missing someone ourselves. We might have a headache. We might be in a rush. So part of how we interpret someone else's story will certainly matter based on how we're feeling or our own lived experience. So again, we have the capacity for cognitive empathy, but it is not a perfect science. But guess what? We can become more empathic with practice, and I'll talk more about that. Okay, moving on. Thank you again for the engagement. There'll probably be a couple of other times where we'll do some stuff together. I want to make the point that we're born with the capacity to empathize, all right? Babies almost straight out of the womb are able to feel someone else in distress. I remember as an empathy researcher, I was so delighted when my daughter was 3 months old. We were out for a walk. She was in the stroller. She was in a great mood. And we walked by another mom who was having, like, pushing, you know, her baby in a poussette, in a little stroller. And that baby was having a meltdown. Now, when I tell you this story, I don't want you to judge me, but as soon as we crossed paths with that other stroller, my daughter noticed the boy crying, and spontaneously my daughter burst into tears. And it was so amazing to witness, because there's something known as the emotional contagion threshold that kicks in at around 3 months for a baby. And so I thought it was very cool to actually see that happen with my own daughter. So not only are we born with the capacity to empathize, but there are milestones of empathy that we hit throughout our lifespan, and we can become more empathic with practice. Now, what's also interesting about empathy is that it follows along a bell curve. So there's highly empathic people, there's low empath people, and then there's most of the people in the middle. Now, on the left side, you'll see that there are psychopaths and narcissists. So those are people who have very low capacity to empathize. In fact, there's research that shows that psychopaths can empathize cognitively, so they know somebody is suffering, but they don't have affective empathy. They don't feel what someone else is feeling, which is why they don't care when somebody else is suffering. So you want to stay away from psychopaths and narcissists. On the other side of the continuum, there are highly empathic people, and then there are empaths. And empaths are different than highly empathic people. So highly empathic people are people who, like, really get you. You feel really heard in their presence. They can extend empathy far and wide. But empaths are different, because empaths are highly sensitive people, and they're almost like emotional sponges. They enter a room and I'm so sorry, I'm being totally distracted by a ding. Does anybody else hear the ding? I've turned my phone off. I'm just going to close it entirely, because you must hear that and it's driving me bonkers. I turned my phone off. I'm going to throw my phone out the door so we don't have to hear the ding anymore. I apologize for that, guys. All right, so empaths are highly sensitive people. They go into rooms, they're like sponges. They can go into a team meeting and they feel what's going on with people. They feel, you know, if somebody's having a hard morning or they're going through something big in life. So it's actually quite exhausting to go through life as an empath. So that is the bell curve of empathy. And some people will ask, you know, is there a difference in terms of gender, and is that nature or nurture? I happen to believe a lot of it is based on nurture, because that bell curve tends to shift a little bit towards the right for women, but that doesn't mean that men don't have a high capacity for empathy, and it also doesn't mean that women aren't capable of being on the left side of that bell curve. Okay, so I'm moving at a bit of a fast pace. If somebody thinks I should slow down, put it in the chat and Catherine will let me know. I can take a few more breaths between slides. If there's any questions, feel free to ask me. Okay, so another thing to know about empathy. First, I said that we are born with the capacity to empathize, but it turns out we also evolved to be empathic. So let me start by saying that about 40 or 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were not the only large brain species that were on the planet. There were about 4 or 5 other large brain species, but humans, Homo sapiens, are the ones that survived and thrived. And why is that? So the evolutionary scientists that study our development looked back at, you know, how our physiology changed and how our physiology was different from those other large brain species. And they discovered a whole bunch of things. They discovered that we lost most of our facial hair. I mean, a bearded man might disagree, but relatively speaking, we lost our facial hair. The testosterone in our bodies dropped. And the thing that I find most interesting is that the whites of our eyes grew very, very big. So if you look at any mammal on planet Earth right now, by ratio, humans have the biggest whites in their eyes. And the reason for that is that we could look at, across distance, and we could read each other's facial expressions, the micro expressions on our face, because we had no facial hair to block that. And we could read each other's eyes. Shakespeare says that eyes are the windows to our soul, but there is reality to the fact that we can really understand each other even without saying a word based on our facial expressions. So the people who studied our evolution say we learned to become empathic as a survival mechanism, and it enabled us to collaborate and thrive as a species. So we're born with the capacity, it's been part of our successful evolution, and if you trace back our lineage further and further and further back, some 10 million years ago, we share DNA in common with these two creatures. So on the left is a picture of a chimpanzee, and on the right is an image of a bonobo. And the story that we have about human nature tends to be the chimpanzee story, that we are hierarchical by nature, violent by nature, prone to violence. And there are plenty of examples littered in history and even contemporary day of the chimpanzee story, right? That we, hoard resources we don't want to share, that we engage in clan warfare. But there is a primatologist by the name of Frans de Waal who studied bonobo culture for more than 40 years. And he believed that if we had spent as much energy studying bonobo culture as we have studied chimpanzee culture, we would have a different conception of what it means to be human. Because bonobos are loving by nature, and they are nurturing by nature, and they are kind by nature, just like we. So I always think that it would be helpful if we leaned into our bonobo lineage a little bit more as a way of elevating our collective empathy. So I'll tell you a little story that brought this really to life for me. I was in a long lineup waiting to send a package, through a fast service. And this was like 15 years ago, before we all had mobile phones attached to our hands. So when you're waiting in line for half hour, you'd easily be distracted by your phone. You'd catch up with emails, watch a YouTube video. But here I was waiting for half hour to get to the counter to send my package. And by the time I got there, I was bored. I wanted to get out of there. And the woman who greeted me was rude. And it's the kind of rude that she wasn't having a bad day. She was like hostile rude. And I remember my first reaction was to feel very assaulted by that. And I wanted to call her immediately out on it. I wanted to say, like, how dare you talk to me like that? But because I had been studying the neuroscience of empathy and the fact that we could become more empathic with practice, in a flash nanosecond, I didn't overthink it, but just like in a really quick instant, I decided, let me practice empathy here. So I took a moment, I looked at her and I said, "Are you okay?" And there was this little moment where she was trying to figure out if I was being passive aggressive or sarcastic. And she knew I wasn't. The question of, "Are you okay?" was really sincere. And she looked at me and she burst into tears. And she said, "I've been working double shifts for 2 weeks straight. My son's at home with a fever and I'm getting sick. It's 3 p.m. I haven't even had a lunch break. I'm hungry. I'm exhausted. I'm just flat out like, I'm so sorry." And 10 seconds earlier, I really didn't like this woman. And then I found myself reaching across the counter. We were holding hands, both of us, tears streaming down our cheeks. So empathy is our superpower, because in an instant, we can flip the switch and create a bridge of understanding and connection. And so I've done a lot of empathy experiments over the years to become more empathic. And I'd like to believe that my family and my friends think I've become more empathic, but I find it very promising that we can actually change the configuration of our brain. Now, if my brain had been connected to an fMRI machine at the time that I was holding this woman's hands, engaged in what I call an empathic embrace, the reading of my brain would have revealed that the pleasure and reward centers of my brain were lit up. Okay, so it feels good to our brain to be connected to someone emotionally. In fact, it lights up the pleasure and reward centers, the same pleasure and reward centers like when we're eating delicious chocolate cake or when we're even high on psychedelics. Okay, so to our brain, it feels really good. It also feels really good to our bodies. So if, again, in that moment of that empathic embrace, I had been hooked up to a bunch of other monitors looking at how my body and physiology was functioning, a few things would have changed in that moment. First, my heart rate would have slowed down and my breathing would have gone from more shallow to deeper breathing. And when both of those things happen, what happens with our hormones is that stress hormones that may be in our body, okay, so certainly I would have been feeling a degree of stress if she treated me rudely when I went to see her. The stress hormones like cortisol would be sort of dipping down and being replaced by the feel-good hormones of oxytocin and serotonin. Those are the hormones that connect us and bond, allow bonding and trust to take place. So a whole host of physiological changes would have happened. And as a result of those, our immune system would be functioning better and inflammation would go down. And inflammation is connected to a whole host of chronic illnesses. So empathy feels good to our brains. It's good to our bodies. And so that sounds like great news, doesn't it? But there is one footnote to that. Empathy is not good for us when we are at our limit, when we are already feeling emotional fatigue, empathy fatigue, compassion fatigue, when we feel like we've just expended all our empathy, that we have nothing left to give, then empathy or the demand of empathy on us actually takes us onto an on-ramp towards burnout. Okay, so we have to guard against that. And when we're at this sort of empathy fatigue threshold, we have to be really, really careful about how we recharge our own batteries. Because if we don't, it has implications for how we behave in our relationships, and it has implications for how we show up in the world. I put a picture of a student, but this is equally applicable to someone who's in the workplace, right? So we have to really be careful about guarding our own empathy reserves. So now what I want to do is I want to take us on a journey, a 6-step journey towards more empathic leadership. And I can give you a couple of case studies for the workplace. I could give you case studies as a student because I understand this is a blended audience. And so let's choose a story that might be applicable here. So let's say, working with the image of the girl at the laptop, let's say you are working on a term paper that's due, you have a deadline, you have other midterms coming your way, you're feeling stressed out, you're tired from many nights of late work, and you get a phone call. And you get a phone call and it's your friend, and you think that she's calling about the paper or the whatever schoolwork you're doing. So you take the call right away. And in fact, she says, "Hey, Molly, do you have a minute?" And she's crying and you can tell she's distressed. So that's the case, okay? That's the moment that I want us to work with. And of course, in the workplace, it could be you come out of a meeting, the meeting goes sideways because you made a mistake on a PowerPoint or your sales numbers are not good and you feel raked over the coals. You walk back to your office, you feel an ugly pit in your stomach. You're berating yourself for having made mistakes, and then you get a knock on the door and it's someone in the office saying, "Hey, Sally, do you have a minute?" And you know you have to be empathic again. So how do you do that? So this is the 6-step process, beginning with self-awareness. So this is a practice I want us to really pay attention to, because if we put it into practice, it could have really big impact and implications for how we are in the world. So number one, self-awareness, having self-awareness. Now, we spend most of our time thinking thoughts and paying attention to our thoughts, okay? That's what Western culture sort of teaches us to do, okay? We're thinking beings, right? So Homo sapiens is the thinking being. But we don't pay attention to how we are actually feeling. And our bodies are giving us feedback in real time all the time. So if you are feeling your stomach, I'm so sorry, there seems to be so much going around in my context. I don't know if you can hear that alarm. Anyways, okay. So the siren of an ambulance. Okay. There seems to be a pit of, you've got something in your stomach, butterflies that don't feel good. Or maybe you feel chalk in your mouth. Or maybe you're noticing that your cheeks are flushed or that your cadence is picking up. All of those physical cues are telling you, I'm feeling stressed out in the moment. And research, again, neuroscience has made it quite clear that our brains cannot be in a state of anxiety or overwhelm and empathy at the same time. It is not possible to our human brain. So if you are feeling stressed or anxious, how can you possibly be expected to empathize with someone else? You cannot. So you have to go through this process. So the first step is self-awareness. I am feeling stressed, and to listen to our body's cues. The second step is once we know we're feeling stressed, we have to learn how to self-regulate. Self-regulation is a fancy psychological term for how do we take our stress down? How do we modulate our stress? How do we step in and say, okay, we're feeling anxious, we're feeling stressed, we're feeling overwhelmed, and how can we calm ourselves down? And one of the fastest ways to do that and the most efficient way to do that, and nobody has to even know you're doing it, is through the breath. So I learned of box breathing not too long ago, maybe a couple of years ago, and it's a practice that I use in high stress situations. And even the US military uses it with its soldiers on the field, on the battleground, or when they're experiencing PTSD. And this is how it works. When you're feeling stressed, you think about box breathing, and this is how it sounds. You take in a deep breath, and please do this from the comfort of your own home, wherever you are as you're on this call. Take in a breath for a count of 3 or 4. And then when you get to the top of the breath, hold for a count of 3 or 4. And then breathe out for a count of 3 or 4. And hold for a count of 3 or 4. And if you do that, you continue doing the box breathing, and you might try to slow it down a little bit if you can. If you do that 2, 3, or even 4 times, your body will naturally flip to its parasympathetic system. And you will be able to downregulate from high stress to a lower grade of feeling a little bit more calm. All right, so that's a way to self-regulate. Okay, so self-awareness number 1, self-regulation number 2, and then the third step is bridge crossing. That is a moment decision. For example, in the story I gave where I was sending my package through the mail and the woman started crying, the decision I made was to leave my context, like my frustration that she was being rude to me, and make the decision to meet her where she's at. So I crossed the bridge when I said, "Are you okay?" All right, so this step is really quick, okay? You're just, the friend on the call, you're like, I'm here for you. You're making that decision in your mind. Or if the person's knocking on your office door, do you have a minute to talk? You're making the decision to leave your context and be ready for theirs. Step 4 is perspective taking. So here's engaging cognitive empathy. And there are 2 really important golden rules to perspective taking. When somebody's telling you something important, we tend in our culture in the West to be allergic to silence. So what we'll do is we'll fill in gaps of silence because they're uncomfortable to us with oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. Or, oh, I know what you should do about this situation, right? We provide solutions. But in fact, what you want to do is honor silence. Because to somebody who's telling you something important and emotionally laden, they are not paying any bit of attention to the silence because they're busy thinking thoughts and feeling feelings. But if you give permission for empty space, silence to take up room in the conversation, they might see that as an invitation to share even more. So please give space to silence. The second golden rule, which I think is a really interesting skill to develop, is the capacity to reflect back a few words that you just heard. So in therapy, therapists are trained when they hear somebody in their office saying something, they'll take the last 3 or 4 words that the person just uttered and they'll reflect them right back. And I know that sounds maybe robotic or mechanical to do, but this practice of reflecting back the words that you just heard is like it lands for the person who's sharing as a balm. It feels so good. They feel so heard when they hear their own words reflected back. So those are the 2 hacks that I would suggest for perspective taking. And then is a matter of taking empathic action. So in the case of the office, where you came out of a bad meeting, then your direct report knocks on the door and says, "Can I have a minute of your time?" Then they tell you that they have to take 2 days off because they're helping move their mom to an elder care facility because of early stage dementia. Okay, so let's say that's the case. If that is the case and you are the boss and you're stressed out because they're taking 2 days off, is that really the moment to say, okay, let's take out our agendas, and since you're going to be gone for 2 days, let me figure out a new plan for who's going to do work to make the client deliverables? No, that is not the moment to do that. The empathic action that you might want to take in that moment is to acknowledge how hard it was for the person to share their story, acknowledge how difficult their situation is, thank them for having the courage and vulnerability to share and the fact that they trust you with that information, and then say, listen, how are you going to take care of yourself? Maybe you should go for a walk, or maybe you should call a friend. And when you're ready, come back and see me and let's figure out a plan to get the work done while you're away. That's taking empathic action. The last step of this process is self-empathy. And that, again, we are miserable at practicing self-empathy. The woman at the office will go back to the email. The person who's studying for an exam who gets a call from a friend who's distressed, once she gets off the call, he gets off the call, will typically go back to their work without tending to themselves. And so I want to place a little emphasis on the self-empathy piece, given the context of this talk with the framework of the conference, right? It's about health and well-being. So how can we practice self-empathy? There are a couple of ways. The first is to spend more time in nature. In Japan, there's research about a phenomenon that they call shinrin-yuku, which translates into English as forest bathing, which shows that there are healing properties when you are in nature and you're exposed to nature, that it actually has a healing capacity on your physiology. So one of the ways to engage in self-empathy is to spend more time in nature. Another way is to practice gratitude. Now, Catherine, can you tell me how much time we have so that I can sense whether or not we can do another audience participation?
Oh, we have another maybe 15 minutes or so, if you'd like.
15 minutes. Okay, so I won't do an audience participation because I want to get through all my slides and make sure there's time for questions. But essentially, gratitude is what I call the on-ramp to empathy. When you are in a state of gratitude, you can access empathy. So if you're feeling stressed out, there's the box breathing, but another pathway is to pay attention to things you're grateful for. It helps also sort of flip you into the parasympathetic system. And what you could start to do as a practice is to start a gratitude journal where every day, at the end of the day, you write 3 things to be grateful for. And I've been doing this for years by myself, but I now do it with my husband and my 8-year-old daughter. And we have a practice at dinner time that we write what we're grateful for. And it changes how we behave in the days ahead. So for example, when I started practicing the gratitude journal, I remember some days I would write, I'm grateful this day is over, okay? But through the practice, I started to pay attention during the day at all the things that I would make a mental note for. Oh, I got the green light in traffic when I'm late for a meeting. I want to write that down, that I'm grateful I got the green light. So it really changes how you behave in the world to practice empathy. Another way is, of course, through mindfulness practices. One of the things that I would like to share that I learned from someone who studies compassion and mindfulness is the simple act of rubbing your hands together. Maybe you want to do it at home. I'm sorry you hear my rings clanking, but when you start to feel heat in between your hands, what you can do is you can place them on your heart. And on days when you're feeling overwhelmed, you can say to yourself, I'm doing the best that I can. Today, I did the best I can. All right, to treat ourselves with the kindness that we would treat our friends. All right, so I believe we need a change in the world. I believe we need more empathy, and I'm just about to conclude the presentation and happy to answer questions. You probably remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs from an intro to psychology class, right? And once our basic needs are met, we go through the higher order needs until we achieve our full potential. And, you know, he said self-actualization was the highest peak that humanity could get, okay? But just before he died, he actually was writing about how wrong his own model was. And that in fact, the pinnacle of human achievement is really about self-transcendence. The idea of being of service to something greater than ourselves, the idea of contributing to something larger than ourselves and helping others. So I believe that empathy, and in particular purposeful empathy, where we're being intentional about that, allows us to get, access self-transcendence. And when we think about everything that's going on in the world, to go full circle to the opening slides and the crisis that we're facing, we have these sustainable development goals that were launched in 2015. They had a 15-year runway. We're 6 years away from the finish line, and we have only achieved 12% of the goals. So what do we need to do? We need to lean into something else. And there's a new framework that comes out of Stockholm called the Inner Development Goals, the IDGs, to complement the SDGs. And it's about a set of 23 leadership skills that we should be developing, the inner work, in order to create the outer change that we want to see. And you can see in the third column, empathy and compassion is there. So I think it's, the timing is right, where we should all be leaning into empathy as a skill, not only for our personal health and well-being, for our relationships, our workplaces, and the world. And so the invitation I want to leave you with is that we all have the capacity to turn up the volume of empathy in our lives. And that's the invitation I want to leave you with. I want to leave you with this slide. I want you to memorize this image in your mind, that at any moment in time, you can flip the switch or turn up the volume of empathy. If you want, you can go to the Greater Good Science Center and take a test on how empathic you are and what you can do to increase your capacity for empathy. Of course, I want you to visit my YouTube channel. I put out every week a new episode with other experts on empathy. And of course, you can find me on LinkedIn. So with that, I'm going to unshare, and I would love to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Anita, for a very inspiring and fascinating presentation. So I think that many of us at EPFL are indeed convinced of the great importance of empathy in both for leadership at all levels of the institution, but also for teaching. I think that in order to become, that being empathic is very important for being a good teacher. And since teaching is our first mission, education is our first mission, that's also very important for us for those reasons. So I'd like to open the floor to questions now. Please type any questions you have in the Q&A, and I'd be happy to read them. I don't think you can actually speak up, so please do type your questions, and I'll be happy to share them with Anita. Yeah, and so I believe I agree with you, Anita, that these IDGs, the internal development goals, these are really interesting. And one thing we're working on at EPFL is really thinking about what it is that our students should be learning besides, to have the highest level of technical competence. What other sort of competencies and skills are important for them? And a lot of the things that I think are important are on that list of internal development goals, sort of maybe under the general heading of emotional intelligence. And that's a very important part of being a good person and being a more effective person as well. So
yes,
I think that we're well aligned.
I encourage people to check out the Inner Development Goals website. They have a 5-minute video that's truly inspiring, and I think will speak to a lot of people that we're at this moment in human history that calls for a different set of skills and really to lean into them. So if you, as a educational institution, are searching for a framework, I think this might be really helpful for you.
Sorry, still waiting for people to speak
Please
up.
don't be shy. Don't be shy.
Yeah.
Just have questions.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe there's a question. Okay, great. So thank you very much for the talk. I believe one context I've been in recently where empathy was important was the working environment. I felt it was sometimes hard for people that never struggled to understand how other people are not doing as well. I wanted to ask, how can we cope with the perhaps lack of empathy at a workplace, or in a way infer that this is what is needed?
Yeah, okay, I love that question. So I'll start with a stat, which is really astounding. 84% of CEOs understand that empathy matters to their business. Okay, and there's research. I mean, post-COVID, it's not just sort of wishful thinking. There's hard science around how empathy in the workplace creates more social capital. And when people trust each other more and there's better communication, there's higher levels of innovation, there's higher levels of engagement and productivity, there's lower levels of absenteeism, presenteeism, toxic workplaces fall off to the wayside. So there's just all these ways that organizations benefit. And CEOs get that. They understand that it matters to the business, but 7 out of 10 fear that if they showed empathy at work, they would be less respected. So I think what this question that's being asked is pointing to that even though there's a general acceptance that empathic leadership and empathic culture makes a difference, there's still this gap, this delta between the practice of being an empathic leader. And there's so much more research that shows that if you feel that you can relate to your boss as a human, and your boss feels that they can relate to you as a human being, and that we're just humans showing up to do work together as opposed to employees, that everybody benefits. So I think if there's an absence of empathy in the workplace, it typically is because leaders have not set the tone. And there's important work that needs to be done to help leaders guide leaders away from sort of a hierarchical command and control way of leading to a way of being at work and a way of leading where our humanity is allowed to show up. So there's work for the leader, and then there's also work for the culture. And there's the famous saying that if you don't measure it, we don't pay attention to it. And so there aren't very many organizations that actually assess how much empathy is at work. And so you can do design work with your team to create practices that are rewarded at work that are more empathic. At the individual level, at the peer level, at the hierarchical level, and at the organizational level. So that's a great question. And a lot of the progressive companies have figured it out. A lot of the great leaders have figured it out, but there's a lot more work to do.
Great. So there are two sort of slight related questions. Do you see more companies becoming empathic or having an empathic culture? Is that the way things have evolved over the last, say, 5 or 10 years? And are some countries' cultures more empathic than others?
That's a great question. I'll start with the second one. Countries that have a wider gap between rich and poor are less empathic than countries that have less of a divide. And so if you go back to one of the opening slides where I put empathy on a continuum, and I talked about how if you have more resources and more power, you tend to empathize less. That's the research that points to that those national differences. So if there's less of a gap, more people can relate to each other because more of us are experiencing the same thing, and there's less of this judgment. So that was the second question. The first question was, remind me again, sorry, Catherine?
So it's about the evolution of corporate culture. Are there more companies that are becoming more where empathy is more highly valued and where empathy is being practiced?
The trends would suggest that the companies are moving in the right direction, but not quickly enough. There's a lot of training that's happening. Some of it's happening within the context of EDI. Some of it is within the context of mental health in the workplace. So of course, there's the early adopters who get it. And those are the companies that are able to retain staff and attract new talent. And there are still some in the old guard. There's actually a really interesting book called Reinventing Organizations by Frédéric Laloux that talks about the evolution of organizations across different dimensions. And we're entering the era of teal, where there's trust and self-organizing is one of the characteristics. So I'd say those companies also have more empathy. But it's not, unfortunately, we're not at a critical mass yet, but there's hope. There's hope.
Okay, so thank you for that. And so along these lines, there's someone who says, thank you, Anita. How would you approach people that do not view empathy as a skill or a priority in the workplace? And another comment that's along similar lines, what should we do if someone in our circle of friends is not empathic at all? So on one hand, how do you convince somebody that's a priority? And then how do you deal with people who are simply not empathic?
So that's a general question. And of course, some of the particularities, like, is your friend your best friend and you have 20 years of friendship and you want to keep the friendship? Or is it a new person that you met and that, you could quickly kind of ghost? I mean, so my answer has to be taken into context that the specificities of the relationship are important as well. But in general, if somebody is incapable of expressing empathy or showing empathy, that is a problem. And there's, a set of words like emotional vampire, where they just suck so much from the relationship that you spend time with these friends and it's exhausting. Or when it's your turn to share, they don't give space for empathy. They immediately talk about how that's relevant to them. The reality is that those relationships are not healthy for you, and that you want to extract yourself from them if you can, or you want to have a hard conversation and you want to bring this issue to their attention and say, I feel that you are not listening with empathy, and I want to tell you how that feels for me, and I want to find a way that we can work together to make improvements. But if that relationship doesn't improve, the ideal would be to step away from it. The second one had to do with the workplace, which is, again, really tricky, right? If it's your boss and you have a mortgage, you might not be able to leave your job. And most of the time, and this is a generalization, but most of the time, people who work from a fear-based leadership style and don't show vulnerability and sort of have hard time with authenticity in the workplace have mostly been raised in a culture and a family where there's been judgment and criticism. And so they reflexively are always feeling like they're being judged. And they don't let down their guards, because if they do, they fear that other people might point at them and say, oh, here are all your weaknesses. People who have come from more healthy, with more attachment type parenting environments tend to be more comfortable in their own skin and tend to have a capacity to show their vulnerabilities and therefore be okay with expressing their feelings more openly. So the work of helping a leader become more empathic is not something that you as an employee can do much about. It's a journey for that leader to have self-awareness about how their own experiences in life have brought them to the kind of boss that they are. But obviously with colleagues, there's an opportunity for conversations, for candid conversations, just like with your friends.
Okay, thank you. So now we have one more sort of, I would say, academic comment. So this person says, if I may echo some critique against empathy from Paul Bloom, it seems like empathy is a rather local method. It is easier to empathize with someone similar to oneself than someone dissimilar. Paul Bloom suggests rational compassion as something less emotionally based to take the place of empathy for more complex, large-scale problems. How do you think empathy is for less familiar and less intuitive problems?
Great question. So Paul Bloom is a very prolific psychologist, and I admire a lot of his work, but unfortunately, he didn't do empathy justice in that book because he didn't talk about the significance of cognitive empathy. So when he refers to empathy, he's looking primarily at affective empathy, which is very similar to compassion. So that's why he can get away with making the claims that compassion is superior, or rational compassion is superior to empathy. I make the case that empathy on purpose, which is really empathy, cognitive empathy, when we're making decisions to be empathic, is very similar to his rational compassion. So I write about his book in my book, and folks that are in the empathy world have all come to the same conclusion that that's the weakness in his argument.
Okay, thank you for that detailed and, for me, convincing answer. Are there any further questions for Anita? We've had a really great conversation so far. Anything more? Maybe Albertine, do you want to take advantage of being online to ask a question?
No, thank you very much. It was really interesting. Thank you, Anita, for this talk, really. And Catherine also.
Yeah, well, in that case, I think we'll close. Thank you so much, Anita. It was a really fascinating discussion. It really resonates, I think, with many of us, and really hope that this sort of revolution in understanding and working with others, and in leading, and how we teach, that this will